Will and should Peter Laviolette survive this season with the New York Rangers? We debate.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1265 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, and we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, obviously, we have a non-game recap episode to do here, and I was kind of on the fence as far as what we wanted to talk about, but I think something that is certainly on the minds of a lot of Ranger fans right now, myself included, is the job security or lack thereof for Peter Laviolette. And you can maybe even throw Chris Drury in there as well. To me, that's a different topic for a different day, because I do think if one of them is no longer with the Rangers during this season, after this season, going into next season, whatever it might be, I think certainly that will end up being Peter Laviolette rather than Chris Drury, even though I would opine that Drury is probably a little bit more to blame for this mess than Peter Laviolette. But regardless, we'll save the Drury conversation mostly for a different day. For right now, we're going to focus in on Peter Laviolette. We're going to start today by discussing whether or not Peter Laviolette will make it through this current ongoing season here for the New York Rangers. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk about if he does, if he will, and if he should be back with the Rangers next season. So a lot to do here as it pertains to Laviolette. Will he survive this current season? There are obviously no guarantees, but I think, just to throw it out there right at the top here, and then I'll explain my reasoning in just a second, I think Peter Laviolette will indeed survive this season. And honestly, I think he actually should survive this season. And I'll explain why he should in just a little bit. But as far as why he will survive this season, there's a couple of different reasons. To begin with, I think when you look at how the Rangers got here and what an epic, monumental collapse this team had for more than a quarter of the season, you look at where they were then versus what they're doing now. And I know this is a rough weekend of Ranger hockey. I was really tough on them after the Ottawa game and probably even tougher on them after the Columbus game. Despite all that, and this can't even be denied, they are playing far better in March, February, January than they were in December and November. November and December, it's as bad of a stretch of hockey as I've ever seen the Rangers play. It's as bad of a stretch of hockey as you will ever see any NHL team really, period, undergo. Obviously there are teams in the NHL right now that have worse records than the Rangers, and they seem to be farther away from contending than the Rangers are. Obviously the Rangers have been contenders the last couple of seasons here, but in terms of just purely awful, no-fight hockey, that took the cake. The Rangers went 4-19 in November and December. So just looking at this logically, or as logically as I possibly can, in a season that's gone the way that this one has for the Rangers, if Laviolette can survive a 4-19 stretch, then he can probably survive, whatever the Ranger record is in the year of 2025. And they're getting close to the finish line anyway. So for all those reasons, I feel like he probably will make it through the season. Another reason why I think he will make it through and probably even should make it through is that I don't think a coaching change at this stage in the game for the Rangers, or really any other team that's in a similar position as the Rangers might be in right now, I don't think a coaching change propels this team to a Stanley Cup championship. Call me crazy, but I don't think that firing Peter Laviolette and hiring Bruce Boudreau or generic coach number 652 that gets recycled in all these different, NHL hiring cycles here, I don't think doing that is going to make a difference. Maybe they play a little bit better. Maybe it sparks them a little bit. Maybe they at least make it to the playoffs. But you'll forgive me if I'm not bullish on the idea of a coaching change suddenly sparking this team to a Stanley Cup championship, especially at this stage in the season. So I just don't really see a whole lot of upside to doing it. Another reason why I don't think Peter Laviolette will be fired as this season goes on here is because it feels like, and I don't know this for sure, but I'm just going by what's reported and also what hasn't been reported. And that is the very simple idea that it seems like Peter Laviolette has a much better relationship with Chris Drury than Gerard Gallant did. During what turned out to be Gallant's final season, they're playing the Devils in the first round of the playoffs. The Rangers have a rough loss in game 4, just didn't play well at all. And multiple reporters say that there was basically a screaming match going on between Gerard Gallant and Chris Drury. Those two had really begun to clash by that stage in the game. And if you think about earlier in that season, when the Rangers were going through a rut, much like they did this year, Chris Drury, per multiple reports, was actually considering an in-season coaching change while that season was ongoing there with Gerard Gallant. Obviously, he ultimately decided against it. But when you look at what's gone on with Peter Laviolette this season, there haven't been any reports, at least. We don't know everything that goes on behind closed doors, but there haven't been any reports of the two of them clashing. There haven't been any reports of any screaming matches after any, difficult losses. There haven't been any reports of Chris Drury toying with the idea of making a coaching change. Maybe he has. I mean, when a team goes 4-19, I do think that that's got to give you at least some idea, some, the thought has to at least occur to you, right? Like, maybe we should make a little bit of a change here. Maybe we should go with a different coach. If that thought doesn't at least pop into your head as a GM, you're probably not human. But the bottom line, there haven't been any such reports that have come out as it pertains to, Peter Laviolette and his job security and Chris Drury potentially wanting to make a change. So there's all that to consider. As far as why he should finish the season, I mean, in a way, we've already somewhat covered that. And I'll build on something that I talked about just a second ago. I don't think there's really an obvious answer as far as who replaces him. And I don't want to hear Joel Quenneville for 1 second. So just get that nonsense out of here with that. I don't want to hear Mike Keenan. Take a hike with that too. The one off the wall idea that I do not hate nearly as much. I don't hate any idea that anybody throws out there. Let me just say that. But there's an idea that in the past I've been firmly against, and I don't dislike it nearly as much as I used to, and I don't dislike it nearly as much as I would like to, because on paper it's just crazy. But the idea of bringing Mark Messier to be the head coach. And I don't think it'll happen down the stretch here. I don't think it'll happen at all. But if Peter Laviolette does get fired, like as a quick aside here, bring in Mark Messier. Look, it's completely off the wall. It's completely over the top. Mark Messier, other than just being a great leader when he was a player, there's not really a whole lot to go on there as far as like firm reasons why he would be a good NHL coach and the answer for the New York Rangers. But the more you look at the way this team is wired and the way things tend to go down with this franchise, and the fact that this team is now going to have one Stanley Cup in 85 years, maybe it's time to do something a little bit off the wall and a little bit crazy. So I'm more open to that idea than I ever have been in the past. But that's a different discussion for a different day. I still would probably think better of it, but I wouldn't rule it out the way that I have certainly in the past. But again, there's no obvious coach to take the reins in season, I don't think. You could maybe turn over the ship to one of the current assistant coaches. It's not going to be Phil Housley. I don't think that the way the Ranger defensemen have played this season reflects all that well on him. So you got to figure if it was going to be one of the assistant coaches, you're probably looking at either Michael Pekka or Dan Muse. I would think probably Pekka. It's hard to say for sure. He feels like he might be a little bit higher up on the hierarchy than Muse is. I don't know that for sure. Pekka's got a lot of cachet, being, a former hard-nosed, tough player and skilled player in the NHL. He might be the guy. He would seem to be the guy that will end up being a head coach before Muse does. And I don't know that for sure. That's just kind of a gut feeling kind of a deal there. But the thing about hiring, not really hiring, but promoting either one of them to head coach, I mean, they're not blameless in this mess either. They're on the coaching staff, right? This is an entire roster of players that is underachieved this year and has a whole laundry list of problems. And while most of that is going to fall on the head coach as opposed to the assistant coaches are not blameless in a situation like this. So I'm not exactly jumping for joy at the idea of making one of those two, the head coach, just, making a change for the sake of making it. Would the players and the Rangers respond better to either one of Pekka or Muse if they were promoted to head coach than they're currently responding to Peter Laviolette? It's possible, but at the same time, it's not exactly a new voice in the room. It's a new lead voice, yes, but those guys have been there. They've been there for all this season and all last season, so it doesn't really seem like that impactful of a change. I could be wrong about that. Who knows? Maybe if Pekka was named the head coach, these guys would be ready to skate through a wall, but you'll certainly forgive some of my skepticism, watching everything that we've watched about this Ranger team this season. when it comes to the idea of, them suddenly doing a complete 180 just because Pekka is now the head coach instead of, one of the assistant coaches. And the biggest reason for me, as far as why Peter Laviolette should survive this season, and it's something that I've talked about off and on throughout the entire year, all this speculation, are they going to make a change at head coach? Are they going to make a change at general manager? My thing when it comes to potentially firing Peter Laviolette and potentially bringing a new head coach, I don't want to let these players off the hook. At a certain point, this is your head coach. How many fresh starts do these guys get? How many coaches do they get to fire in such a short amount of time here? If Peter Laviolette were to get fired before this season ended, that would mean that the Rangers are on their fourth head coach. Whoever gets hired to be the new head coach wouldn't change the fact that they would then be on their fourth head coach in the last 5 seasons, with 2 conference final appearances sandwiched into the middle of all that. We talked the other day when the Rangers scored 2 shorthanded goals to tie the game against Columbus and then lost the game by 4 goals. We talked about how there's no way that's ever happened in AHL history. You can add another scenario to that list, because without going through the entire history of this league, I have a very difficult time believing that ever there's been a situation where any team in the AHL has had 4 coaches in 5 years. I mean, to begin with, that's already pretty extreme. You don't see that very often in and of itself. But to have 2 conference final championship appearances right in the middle of all that, how is it even possible to cram that much success, the 2 conference championships, combine that with that much failure? 3 coaches getting fired and being on your 4th coach in 5 years. There's no way that's ever happened either. Never say never. I would have to go through the entire archives and try to figure this out. But I just don't, I can't imagine that's ever happened quite like that. And if we want to really exaggerate this and really take this to the nth degree here, let's just take David Quinn's final game as head coach of the Rangers, right? He got to close out his last season there, his 3rd and final season with the Rangers. He had the last game, which I believe the Rangers won. They obviously didn't make the playoffs, but he had his final game. Then you get 2 full seasons of Gerard Gallant after that. Then you get 1 full season of Peter Laviolette. And now you've got this season of Laviolette plus whoever would replace him as head coach. So looking at it that way, it would be 4 different head coaches for this team in less than 4 complete seasons of hockey, with, once again, 2 conference final championship appearances sandwiched in between that. It's unreal. There's no way it's ever gone down quite like that for any team, I'm convinced. But, I do think Laviolette survives the season. Now, they do play the Jets tonight, and if they go out there and lose 6-1, hey, that could change things quickly. That could be the final straw. Certainly nothing is off the table in a season quite like this. But I do think Laviolette will survive the season. I think he should survive the season. But will Peter Laviolette be back next season? And should he be back next season? That's what we're going to talk about in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Factor. Looking to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor makes eating well easy with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies, breakfast, and grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day long. I love how Factor takes the stress out of meal planning. The convenience is unbeatable. No prep, no mess, just great food in minutes. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL50 off and use code LockedOnNHL50 off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code LockedOnNHL50 off at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL50 off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here. On Locked On New York Rangers, big shout out to the everydayers. As always, Rangers going to be back in action later tonight at 8 p.m. at Winnipeg against the Jets. God help us all. The Jets have more points in no team in the NHL, I should phrase it that way. No team in the NHL has more points this season than the Winnipeg Jets. The Jets are also 23-5-4 at home. So good luck. Let's see what happens. At this point, essentially nothing would surprise me. But back to Peter Laviolette here. Will he be back next season? Should he be back next season? I'm going to go ahead and say no to both. And we'll start once again with the will. Will he be back next season? I was talking a minute ago about the Rangers cycling through all these different head coaches and this core group of players getting coach after coach after coach fired. I mean, we can't go more than 6 months without having to talk about the coach potentially getting fired, or the coach actually did get fired, or who's going to be the new head coach, who should be the new head coach, what kind of coach should they bring in. This is always a point of discussion, not just on this podcast, but certainly among Ranger fans everywhere. And we can never go longer than half a year without this popping up in one way or another. But, I talked about Gerard Gallant very briefly in the last session. As far as Peter Laviolette, will he be back next season? Let's go ahead, do a quick comparison to Gerard Gallant, because there's obviously a lot of similarities there. They come in, immediate success. First season, you go to the Eastern Conference Final when I think, certainly with Gallant and to a lesser extent with Laviolette, not too many people had the Rangers making it that far in either one of those seasons. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they did. So obviously immediate success for each head coach. Didn't get the ultimate prize, but obviously fun runs and seasons that I think you would have to look at as successful. And certainly, okay, we can build on this, that kind of a situation there. So then what happens in year two? Well, both of them, there's a pretty dramatic fall off. There's just that kind of feeling in the air that something is not right with this team. It pretty much lingered through the majority of Gallant's second season. It has lingered for pretty much the entirety of Peter Laviolette's second season. There have been some good stretches here and there, but for the most part, it just feels like something has really, really been off with this team pretty much the entire season. And like I mentioned a second ago, more problems than we can possibly list. We've done our best to list them after, the loss to the Senators, the loss to the Blue Jackets, but you guys know the deal if you've watched this team this year. But again, sticking with this comparison between Gallant and Laviolette, this is the big difference here as far as what went down in year two with Gallant and what's going down in year two with Laviolette. For all the issues and all the struggles that team had in Gallant's second year, they still ended the regular season with 107 points and obviously made the playoffs quite comfortably. For Peter Laviolette, they currently have 68 points, and they may very well miss the playoffs. We'll see what happens. The book is not yet been completed, but they are certainly in danger of missing the playoffs. And if the Raiders were to go, they've got 18 games left. If they were to go 18-0, try not to laugh too much. I can feel it happening as people are listening and or watching this episode. Just roll with it for the purposes of this point that I'm about to make here. If the Rangers were to go, I'll try to get through this without laughing. If the Rangers were to go 18-0 the rest of the way, that would mean they would end up with 104 points. That's still less points than what this team had in year two with Gerard Gallant. With Gallant, they had 107, and even with the Rangers going undefeated the rest of the way, they would finish this season with fewer points, 104, than what they had in the second season with Gerard Gallant. And here's a spoiler for you guys. Probably the most bold thing that I've ever said on Locked On New York Rangers. The Rangers are not going to go 18-0 down the stretch here. So clearly, this team has done worse in year two with Peter Laviolette than it did in year two with Gerard Gallant. So if Gerard Gallant got fired, then how can you justify keeping Peter Laviolette? The only sort of backdoor way out of this is if the Rangers do eke their way into the playoffs and win at least one series, because then you could at least look at it and say, well, okay, they went through some tough times. They still made the playoffs. And if the Rangers do win a playoff series, it's going to have to be against one of the top teams in the Eastern Conference, because the Rangers will be a wild card and they would have to knock off a team like the Capitals. Much easier said than done. At least if they do that, you could make that argument that, okay, they found their way in and they beat a really good team, and there's your justification for bringing back Peter Laviolette. But that's a lot of things that need to happen. And frankly, a lot of things that don't really seem all that likely. As far as whether or not Laviolette actually should be back next year, I mean, I've kind of been talking about this on and off throughout the entire episode, but I just don't see how it can be justified. I pretty much just laid out a reason just a second ago, comparing year two of Laviolette with year two of Gerard Gallant. And year two with Gallant, that cost Gallant his job. And the Rangers are far worse this year than they were in year two with Gerard Gallant. This team has far too many no-shows, far too many bad starts. Nearly every player on the roster has regressed. This team goes from winning the President's Trophy, making it to the conference final, to very possibly missing the playoffs entirely. They're undisciplined with all the bad penalties, all the unnecessary penalties, all the too many men on the ice penalties. They're unfocused. They can't play a full 60. I mean, it really does seem that way. Doesn't seem to be any real leadership. Who's exactly driving this boat right now? Is it Laviolette? Is it the Rangers, quote unquote, leaders? I mean, it just, you just look at the entire body of work and you look at the vibes surrounding this team, and it just becomes more and more difficult to bring back Peter Laviolette. Now, again, this story has not been completed yet. It's possible. Anything's possible, right? They could go on a little bit of a run. They could get in. They could make a little bit of noise at least. And maybe then you feel a little bit better about bringing Peter Laviolette back. But if this season ends the way that it's felt for a long time, like it's going to end, with the Rangers either missing the playoffs entirely or barely sneaking in there and then getting slaughtered in the first round, then I don't see how you can justify bringing back Peter Laviolette, especially when you once again compare him to what happened in year 2 with Gerard Gallant. This is far worse than anything that happened in year 2 with Gerard Gallant. So I don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens. With Gallant, it felt like the writing was really on the wall. Once they lost the Devils, it was like, this guy is a dead man walking. With Peter Laviolette, I'm not so sure. They might give him a little bit of a mulligan. They might bring him back as they continue to retool the roster a little bit. They might try to move on from some veterans. They might try to go a little bit younger next season. And maybe if that's the case, then you can justify bringing him back for one more shot at it. But here's my ultimate worst case scenario. And this is something that I talked about a while back. And I think some of you guys kind of chimed in on this as well. If you're the Rangers, this is actually my best case scenario. And then I'll explain my worst case scenario. Let Peter Laviolette finish out the season. Let this story be told. Let whatever happens, let whatever is going to happen. And then assess at the end of the season and decide with conviction, is Peter Laviolette coming back for year 3 or is he not? Either dig in and say, you know what, you guys figure it out. We're not going to fire another coach to coddle you anymore. You have to figure it out with Peter Laviolette. This guy's a good coach and we're behind him. You go with that, or you say, you know what, this isn't working out. This team has clearly regressed. Whether it's on the players or not, they're clearly not buying whatever this coaching staff is selling, and it is time to take things in a different direction. Decide one of those two after the season is over. I don't want to see a situation where the Rangers bring back Peter Laviolette next season, and they do so in kind of a wishy-washy way. There's no real conviction. There's no real oomph behind it, and then they fire him 4 games into the next season. That is my absolute worst case scenario. And you might hear that and think like, oh, well, they wouldn't do it like that. It's not as crazy as it sounds. First of all, we're talking about the New York Rangers here. That's first and foremost. So anything is possible. We've certainly learned that over the years. But beyond that, it's not as uncommon as you might think for a team to do that in the NHL, where they bring back a coach and then they fire him 5 games in the next season, 6 games in the next season, 4 games in the next season. I forget who it was, but I was doing some research on this, months ago and trying to, I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but kind of looking at the quick hooks that have happened throughout NHL history. Might have just been for my own amusement. But I saw a coach, and again, don't remember who it was. He was fired 2 games into a season. So why is he your coach in the first place? Like, if you are willing to fire a coach after 2 games, no matter how those 2 games unfold, then he should never be there to begin with. And it's the same thing with Peter Laviolette. Decide after this season, are we moving forward with him or are we going in a different direction? I'm not going to go nuts either way. I do think if things keep going the way they're going, then probably the better move, not even probably, definitely the better move, I would say, is to move on. Again, I hate bailing out these players and coddling them like this, but at a certain point, you can't let this go on and on and on and on for a whole nother season, right? So I think the best course of action would be to move on and bring in a new coach. But whatever you decide, do it with conviction and say, this is the direction we're going, and we're not going to look back and we're not going to second guess ourselves. That's the big thing that the Rangers have to do before the start of next season as it pertains to Peter Laviolette and a potential new head coach. So I'm going to keep everything rolling in just a second here. I'm actually going to shift our attention to a couple of small acquisitions that the Rangers made right near the deadline. 2 players that we have not yet had the opportunity to discuss in great detail, but we are going to do that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that is both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1-ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they are packed with fiber and better-for-you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shells variety. It is the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days. Whether you're running between meetings or dropping off the kids, Wonderful Pistachios are the snack that works just as hard as you do. The satisfying crack of opening each shell, it's like snack meditation. Get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up today's episode by talking about a couple of players that the Rangers acquired at the trade deadline. Some under-the-radar moves here by the Rangers, but I think it's certainly important to kind of become acclimated with these players and try to figure out what kind of role they'll have with the Rangers, if any, going forward. As we know, the Rangers have been wheeling and dealing all season. 8 trades in the span of 3 months that culminated, obviously, with the trade deadline day. But there were a couple players here that we haven't gotten to talk about in great detail yet. 23-year-old Brendan Brisson and 28-year-old right winger Nicolas Aube-Kubel. And we'll start with Brisson, 6 feet tall, 191-pound center. Brisson is a former first-round pick in 2020 by the Vegas Golden Knights. He went number 29 overall that year. So you look at it that way, between his age and between his draft pedigree here, there might be some upside here to speak of. Obviously, it wasn't enough to stick in Vegas's lineup and make any kind of a big-time impact there, but he is still very young at 23, and he was a former first-rounder. So it's possible that, with the right amount of coaching and development, that he could turn into, still a solid NHL player, still just in his early 20s. And he was, of course, acquired in the trade that sent Riley Smith to Vegas. The Rangers in that trade got a 3rd-round pick, which they then used to acquire Carson Soucy, as well as Brendan Brisson. And Brisson, in his career in the NHL, just 24 games, all with Vegas, 2 goals, 6 assists. He's a -8, 22 hits, and 4 block shots. Now, that's obviously a small sample size, and clearly he didn't have that big of a role with Vegas. It is worth pointing out that he does tend to produce a little bit more offensively at the AHL. We know what a massive jump it is from the AHL to the NHL. But with that said, 164 AHL games for Brisson, including now 2 with Hartford since the trade went through, 44 goals, 58 assists. So 102 points in 164 games. It's not mind-blowing, but it's certainly not nothing either. We're looking at, somewhere around like 2/3 of a point per game. So it's a decent amount of production. Still looking for his first point with the Hartford Wolfpack. As far as like the short-term and long-term outlook, I mean, you can never have too many centers when it comes to your organizational depth. And I think you can certainly do worse than somebody who has produced at least somewhat at the AHL and somebody who, again, is young and is a former first rounder. It's possible that he's still developing a little bit and that he could, turn into a decent NHL player. I think that's certainly at least still on the table. But as far as like, getting a crack with the Rangers and being promoted from the Wolfpack, somebody that I think would probably have to produce at a pretty high clip at the AHL in order for him to get the call. Even this season, even if the Rangers fall out of it this year, I know some people are going to be looking for them to promote this player, promote that player. I don't really see it happening with Brisson because I feel like they would rather take a look at some of their own homegrown guys, whether that's, obviously Othman or Berard, even guys that they've brought in like Parsonen, like Kaliev. Kaliev's going to be in the lineup over Berard. Berard's a healthy scratch, which is a whole nother mess in and of itself. Not a fan of that move by Peter Laviolette. But yeah, as far as Brisson goes, wouldn't rule it out. Injuries could always change things. Or again, if the Rangers do fall out of the playoff chase, then maybe they want to get a look at him. But I'm not really looking for him to get called up this season. But we shall see. One other thing I wanted to point out here that some Ranger fans have pointed out, Brisson is the son of famous NHL agent Pat Brisson. And so a lot of fans kind of throwing out the idea that maybe this will give the Rangers a leg up when it comes to contract negotiations with other players. They can land some big name players that, Brisson's father represents. I don't know how likely that is, but I suppose stranger things have happened. Who knows? But Brisson on a 2-way contract at $925K per season. He's an RFA after the year, so I fully expect him to stick in the Rangers organization once the season ends. Let's also talk about a more familiar name, Nicolas Aube-Kubel. The Rangers acquired him from the Buffalo Sabres on deadline day. He is a former Stanley Cup champion and kind of gained a little bit of, I wouldn't really say fame, but like people kind of noticed this, obviously, because when he won the Cup with Colorado a few years ago, he was skating over for the team photo, and he was, I guess, maybe the last guy to hold up the cup. He still had the Stanley Cup with him, and he basically wiped out and dropped the Stanley Cup right on the ice. And they all had a good laugh about that, but apparently it dented the cup. I mean, that cup is, it's been through the ringer over the years, that's for sure. But yeah, I mean, he did win the Stanley Cup with the Avalanche, for whatever that's worth. He skated in 14 of the 20 Colorado games in the playoffs that season. And as far as like his background is concerned, again, 28 years old. He is 5'11", 196 pounds, drafted in the second round by the Flyers all the way back in 2014 and number 48 overall. And in order, he has played for the Flyers, the Avalanche, the Leafs, the Caps, the Sabres, and now the Rangers. So obviously he's bounced around quite a bit. 301 career NHL games, 32 goals, 48 assists, 80 points, and is a plus 11. He's also got 665 hits in that time, despite, usually being a bottom six guy. So obviously very physical, getting a lot of hits despite not getting a ton of ice time, 88 block shots as well. And for whatever this is worth, and probably not much, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Peter Laviolette did coach him for one season with the Washington Capitals, so there's some familiarity. I'm not so sure he's going to coach him for even one game with the Rangers, because first of all, Abe-Kubel would have to be called up, and secondly, Peter Laviolette would have to remain the Ranger coach for, at least the rest of this season and possibly even next season as well, and I just don't know how likely that all is. One thing to know about Abe-Kubel, he will definitely fight. If you type his name into the YouTube search engine, the first 4 videos that come up, or at least for me, were all fights, including one against Vincent Trocheck. That was only 3 months ago. That was in December. And it was a situation where he kind of got Trocheck with a little bit of a reverse check, and Trocheck got up, and they're kind of scrapping and pushing and shoving, and the sticks were up a little bit, and then the gloves come off, and they fight. Pretty even tilt. It didn't last very long. They both kind of fell to the ice. But I can only imagine that Trocheck at that point was probably trying to snap his teammates out of their collective coma that they had been in for however many weeks at that time. But, kind of the same thing here with Abe-Kubel as with Breeson. Do we see him this year? I'm going to say probably not. Not out of the question. But again, you look at the way this season has gone, and if the Rangers do fall out of it, you're going to want to get looks at Offman. You're going to want to get looks at Berard, and even Kaliev, who they claimed on waivers and is still a young player, and even Parsonen, who they brought in at the trade deadline. It's not the craziest thing ever. Again, he's played a lot of games in the NHL, so maybe they'd want to see how he can do. But the other thing to consider here, he's actually a UFA at the end of this season. So you could bring him back. You certainly don't have to, but there's no real urgency to get Brisson or to get Abe-Kubel to the NHL. But we'll call it there for today. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in, and I will see you next time.